Welcome in to Daily Faceoff Live, your go-to source for everything hockey. Live every weekday at noon Eastern.
We continue to creep closer to deadline day. Welcome into Daily Faceoff Live. I'm Tyler Yaremchuk. He is our Daily Faceoff NHL insider, Frank Saravalli, and we are ready for 30 minutes of straight hockey talk. Frank, welcome back to the show. You missed a crazy couple days.
Was it that crazy?
No, not really. Just a lot of talk about guys getting healthy scratch for trade-related reasons, which I know you would have loved to discuss, though. Let's keep the deadline talk going, though. So 2 minutes and 30 seconds up on the clock. And, yesterday was Valentine's Day. So February 15th, I felt like it was fitting to give out a little tough love. You wake up the day after. I just feel like this lines up. Some GMs who are maybe looking at their situation, and maybe their fans are holding out hope that, hey, we can get back into the playoff race, or we're in the playoff race. We want our GM to just get us another piece or two to push us right in. I think there's some, though, who have to look in the mirror and say, we just don't got it this year. And the team I want to start with, Frank, is the Nashville Predators. And before we give our thoughts on it, I thought it was interesting to listen to their GM, David Poile, the other day on Robbie and Rex Road in Nashville, who had some interesting comments ahead of the deadline.
Would you have to be in a much worse position mathematically by that day or by that direct time period to seriously consider selling?
That's what keeps me up at night. Right now we're still below the line, not in the playoffs. We're running out of time. Just like this interview, I've been talking about inconsistency and people need to play better, but that hasn't happened on a regular basis. So I do not think we're a buyer. Let's start with that. And I think if things don't change more favorably and get in some kind of winning streak, we certainly could be a seller, but that's not today.
Interesting stuff from David Poile, Frank, saying we are not going to be a buyer. I also like the line of that's what keeps me up at night as the Preds sit outside of the playoffs. Should David Poile be considering, not just not being a buyer, but also going into maybe a full-on sell mode?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's something that he's obviously wrestled with for a while now, going back to early January. That's when I believe the Preds for the first time engaged in some discussions about, hey, if someone like Mattias Ekholm were on the table, what would a deal look like? And so I think they've been having flirtations with being a seller. Every time it looks like this team's out of it, they go on and win 3 games and kind of sucks David Poile and the Preds and their fans right back into it. And that makes it difficult. But here's the argument I would make from a 30,000-foot view is that let's say this team is able to get in. Does anyone really look at the Nashville Predators as a contender? I don't. And the difficult part about being a seller is you look at the term and contracts that they have on their books. There's only a select few number of players. I think even Ekholm at this point with that term might be a little bit difficult to trade because people are looking at Ryan McDonough, another guy on their blue line, saying, geez, we saw the Tampa Bay Lightning move away from them. I'll give you a couple names to consider if indeed the Preds decide to go down the seller path. One is Mikael Granlund. I think with all of the different aspects of the game that he touches, including penalty kill, at $5 million a year for the next couple years, there would certainly be interest there. I think some lower level interest than that in someone like Nito Niederreiter, 30 years old. $4.5 million. Tanner Jeannot is a guy who's going to have an interesting RFA case, hitting 24 goals last year, but has just 5. And I would imagine that the Preds would probably also be looking in that case, or at least flirting with the idea of moving like someone like Dante Fabro on their back end.
Interesting stuff. Quickly, 30 seconds or less. I was looking out east. A team in a similar spot is Detroit, but they actually have some more pieces they can move off. Does Yzerman maybe need to look at David Poile and say, yeah, we might both have to sell off?
Yeah, it seems like those two franchises are in totally different spots. The Red Wings are building up, and the Preds are probably in a spot where they need to begin to tear down. But, we all have kept our eyes on Dylan Larkin, but Tyler Bertuzzi is a guy that would have a ton of interest out there based on the season he had last year, and the style with which he plays certainly would bring a lot of bite to your lineup. And after that, Oli Mata on the back end. A lot of teams have asked me in the last few weeks, how big of a gap is there between Oli Mata and Vladislav Gavrikov? And I would make the argument not much, but probably a huge gap in acquisition and asset cost.
Interesting stuff. We'll continue the deadline talk in just a second, but let's go to the ice last night, where the big story was the big man between the pipes for the Ottawa Senators, Kevin Mandolese, who stood tall, stopping 46 shots in a shootout victory for the Ottawa Senators. He was just absolutely lights out, and this is, again, one of those heartwarming stories that we get throughout the season. I think we have a video of just, them winning the shootout. And also what I loved was his family's reaction up in the stands. Like, they were just sitting on pins and needles on every single moment of that shootout. It was unreal. Frank, just what a moment.
Yeah, it was. And I love seeing stuff like that for someone like Kevin Mandolese and all the things that he's been through in his career. I thought it was interesting to hear Senators coach after the game, DJ Smith, saying essentially what impressed him most about Mandolese was that the moment wasn't too big for him. This is a guy that spent time in the ECHL this season, not 3 years ago, not 6 years ago. This hasn't been a, slow build to get to this point. For a kid who was born in Ottawa, raised in Quebec, this is certainly a moment that you're never going to forget. You get thrown into action. The other thing I loved about this, Tyler, was the rookie lap, the hot lap. Yeah. I can't remember seeing a goalie get one, but nonetheless, Mandolese comes in, huge moment for the Sens, who are just kind of hanging tough in the playoff race, not really in it, but really not all that far back from a team like the Buffalo Sabres that we've been saying for the last number of weeks are right in it.
Yeah, and I made the point yesterday that for this Senators team, just getting important games and playing meaningful hockey down the stretch could be really, really valuable to some of those young pieces. Let's flip this game from last night. If you're an Islanders fan, you're probably sitting here saying, I don't care about this guy. My team just lost back-to-back games to the Senators, and we got beat by a no-name goalie in the second game. The Islanders, after grabbing Bo Horvat, I think the pressure kind of kicked up to like, hey, you should probably make the playoffs if you're going to go move your first-round pick for a guy. But back-to-back losses, that is quite the dagger.
Yeah, the pressure has ratcheted up, and that's also actually what made it more impressive for the Sens as they took both games of their back-to-back as well. But the Islanders are in a spot where it looked like they were about to take off after getting Bo Horvat. They start off with 2 wins. Horvat scores on home ice, and all of a sudden it looks like this team is finally trending in the right direction. We were just talking about tough love and some of those teams that might be ready to have some really awkward and or difficult conversations. I would have included the Islanders in that category had they not gone out and traded for Bo Horvat. You could make the argument that they still need to have that conversation potentially in the summer. But every time you turn around with this Islanders team, it seems to take 1 step forward and then 2 steps backward. And that's no way to chase down a Stanley Cup playoff spot.
1 point back of the Washington Capitals for the final wildcard spot, but the Caps do have a game in hand on the Islanders. It's actually going to be a really interesting playoff race in the Eastern Conference. Yesterday, Mike McKenna and I gave some picks for our matchmakers, Frank, and it was your deadline countdown article up at dailyfaceoff.com that had a couple of eyebrows raised with your mock trades, playing hockey's love doctor. So I want to start with the big name, number 1 on the trade targets board, Timo Meier. You put together a deal that has him going to the Carolina Hurricanes, and in return, it's a couple of picks and a couple of prospects. Maybe take us through why this makes sense from a Canes perspective and also that asking price.
Okay, so let's start with the asking price. And I've been saying for a long time now that I think the San Jose Sharks are, despite the incredible season that Timo Meier is having, that if you look at the framework of the deal that sent Alex DeBrincat from Chicago to the Ottawa Senators, a player who's younger, a player who twice hit 40 goals and had 1 more season left on his deal before then coming to that massive qualifying offer that Timo Meier and these other teams are now staring in the face, is that the Sharks are likely to be getting less. So they got a 1st, 2nd, and 3rd round pick. And the 1st round pick, most importantly to note, was number 7 overall. So in this case, this would be less, but I think that this is probably something of a fair compromise when it comes to San Jose, because they do get a 1st round pick. They get a 2nd, a pretty decent college prospect in Scott Morrow, who's been close to a point per game in college, and also Jack Drury, someone that's been sort of right knocking on the door of the NHL, has gotten a call up here and there these last couple seasons, and is someone that obviously the Carolina Hurricanes like at a young age to plop into their lineup. And when I look at it from Carolina's perspective, what they get obviously is the replacement for Max Pacioretty and then some, someone who's a beast, someone who can put the puck in the net, a true shot threat, in addition to Andrei Svechnikov that they would have in their forward group. And I think he also brings a little bit of a different dynamic that the Canes don't really have in their forward group, in the sense that he's got some heft. He's a tough guy to play against at times. He can transport the puck if need be through the neutral zone. So he's certainly an interesting case. And what I like about it from Carolina's perspective is they're thinkers there in that front office. They would appreciate the optionality that comes with what happens to Meier next. You don't have to deal in absolutes. They don't like to pay guys at their highest premium price, which is what Meier would be looking at. I think they'd be one of those teams that would be comfortable saying $10 million qualifying offer, 1 year. Sure, let's do it. They've got $18 million coming off the books this summer, and they're a team that I could see, either keeping Meier, re-signing him, signing him to the qualifying offer, or potentially even trading him after using him as a rental and recouping, 20%, 25 cents on the dollar from what they traded.
And again, there's so much I want to get to with you today, but you also had an interesting Patrick Kane trade idea to the Edmonton Oilers. I think of the Oilers, what they could need, and I think of defense and help in their own end, but going the other way and just saying, hey, maybe we'll outscore our problems with Patrick Kane. Why might this make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly it. You just load up and you say, hey, there's room for 2 Canes in Edmonton, and you put him on a line with either Leon Draisaitl or Connor McDavid, and you watch this team take off. And I think the return is Xavier Bourgault, who is a first-round draft pick. Mm-hmm. So you've got a first and a second, plus you have the Chicago Blackhawks take on Jesse Puljujärvi here, and then you take a 5th-round pick. And since that contract is one that would be needed to roll through a third-party broker with the $10.5 million cap hit, you essentially end up getting Patrick Kane on your books for $2.75 million. Puljujärvi's $3 million going the other way takes care of that. And in this case, the biggest hurdle is not going to be the idea of putting Kane into your lineup. It's, does he want to go there? And I would have to think that when he begins to sort through his options, now that the Rangers are out, the idea of playing potentially with McDavid and or Draisaitl would certainly rise to very near the top of that list.
Could be fascinating in the days leading up to the deadline. We are 16 days away, so let's get to our trade deadline countdown article for today, Frank, and it's centered around the Minnesota Wild, and their GM Bill Guerin has some interesting decisions to make before we get to maybe what they could add ahead of the deadline, because it's a team that's right in the middle of a playoff push here. I want to look at maybe what they could subtract in Matt Dumba. Does what they decide to do with Dumba, is it fair to call that the first domino in Bill Guerin's deadline plans? Like if they move him and get that money off the books and get an asset back, that could really change how the Wild GM handles things, right?
It could. I just don't think that that's exactly the way that they view things. And I think part of the reason for that is Bill Guerin's phone hasn't really been ringing for Matt Dumba. And when that's the case, if someone's going to try and swoop in late and close to March 3rd and say, hey, we'll take Matt Dumba off your hands, he's probably not going to do it and damage his team's own chances, because regardless of whatever you think about Matt Dumba, taking someone that's playing somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 or 21 minutes a night out of your lineup is going to have a trickle-down effect. So the Wild aren't going to cut off their nose to spite their face, even though they'd probably like to recoup and harvest some assets from Matt Dumba. But at the same time, they're keeping an eye on the playoff picture and how this all might work out. So they're in a precarious spot. That team has really struggled on both sides of the All-Star break. They're just 3-6-1 in their last 10. None of those 3 wins have come in regulation. They've needed overtime or shootout. And more concerning is their reliance on even strength scoring. Because I guess you could flip it another way and say what's scary is their reliance on power play scoring, because half of their last 20 goals have been scored on the power play. Just 9 of those 20 in this 10-game run have been at even strength. So they're a team that struggles at even strength, and they also seem to be one where there's some fragility that's creeping into their game. The fact that they're not scoring at even strength ratchets up the pressure for them on their defense and goaltending. The goaltending hasn't been an issue, but what's shown signs of cracking, if you listen to their coach and Dean Evison, is their individual decision-making process on pinches and in the neutral zone. So that's been a big issue for that team that's led to way too many high danger chances against and chances off the rush. So because they're not scoring as much, every mistake that they make has been magnified. So now they're in the second wild card spot. They're clinging to a playoff position. And how big of a buyer are you going to be if you're Bill Guerin? That's the question he's asking himself. I will say this. I don't think they're going to take a huge swing, but if they do, it will be for a rental. And the reason for that is we know the cap situation that they have ongoing next season with the $14 million committed in buyouts to Ryan Suter and Zach Parise. We know the extension that was signed for Boldy. They don't have a ton of cap space to go around, and they're not going to be taking on players that have term, I don't think, in order to try and make this team better in the short term. So reasonably priced rentals would be the place to look.
Full story coming up today on dailyfaceoff.com. Let's get to our big segment for the day. It's the Number Crunch with Cam Charron. The Number Crunch brought to you by our friends at Montana's. You can check them out, montanas.ca. Always a pleasure to welcome this guy, Cam Charron, into the show. And we were talking a little bit about a potential fit for Timo Meier. Cam, I want you to throw on your general manager cap for just a second here. How would you assess how Timo Meier fits into an NHL roster and whether that would influence whether you'd pay a premium if you were a GM to get this guy on your team?
Well, Meier's a very interesting player in that he takes a lot of shots based on he takes a lot of the shots where he's on the ice for. He takes 35% of the over the last 3 years. He's taking 35% of his team's shots when he's on the ice. It's a very difficult way to phrase that, essentially, but that's the highest in the NHL. So we're looking at a player that has a very high shot volume. And he's actually like quite average in terms of his shooting percentage over this span. He's shooting between 8 and 9%. So he's not really lighting things on fire. He's not really as good as, obviously doesn't have the shot of David Pastrnak or Tage Thompson or Nick Ehlers, guys that we think of having a bit more of a better release. So he's a guy that has the puck on his stick a lot. And that can lead to some good things and some bad things. The play really does go through him. So I would be really looking for Meier if I need a player, not necessarily a complimentary one, but one that's really going to drive his own line. I think that he's kind of a less of a fit on teams that don't really need a trigger man, that kind of just need a guy to go in and muck things around on the forecheck, maybe kind of balance out their offensive attack a little bit, especially if it's in the top six. So there are a few teams. I think that Carolina and Toronto are two teams that really make sense for Meier from a stylistic standpoint, because I think that they do need those big shooters, guys that really have the puck on their stick a lot, can transport the puck. And the other thing too is he's just so much of a better fit than other wingers that seem to be available. I was reading Frank's deadline article, the trade targets board, and none of the other wingers really appealed to me that much. And that's why I think that, San Jose is probably going to get a pretty good return, because it's going to force a bidding war, because teams aren't going to see a lot of difference makers. He's the only one that really is that difference maker.
So Cam, if there is a bidding war, that means that someone's going to end up losing out. And if you're the GM that misses on Meier, you were just saying you're looking at the trade targets board and none of them were all that appearing, but there's some other scoring wingers out there, some rentals, some term. Who would you have your eye on?
So I don't think I would pay a first round pick for anyone else on the board or a top prospect, and that includes a guy like Kane. The guy that I'm really interested in actually is Ivan Barbashev. So this graph here is pretty simple. This is just points per 60. 5-on-5 points per 60 from 2022, from the COVID season up to last year, and then this season. Everyone's kind of dropped a little bit because they play on bad teams. That's why they're available at the deadline. Van Riem's like the only exception, but he's never really been first line caliber in terms of his scoring, at least not in the last several years. So Barbashev is actually the one that's really interesting to me. He's almost like the opposite to Meier in that he doesn't take a lot of shots within the zone. It's a lot of playmaking. He really relies on the playmaking. His shot percentage is actually very, very high. He just doesn't take a lot of shots because he's always looking for that extra pass. And he doesn't really touch the puck in the neutral zone or the defensive zone. So he's really kind of that complementary winger that if you have a good shooter, he might be able to increase that guy's shooting percentage. So he's one guy. Patrick Kane, I think he's probably a little bit better that on paper than given credit for. It's just he's also more of a playmaker than a shooter, and he's just played with guys that don't put the puck in the net all that well. His numbers when he's on the ice with Seth Jones, someone who's very good at getting him the puck, are actually quite strong. But obviously he's had a really bad year this year, hit by some injuries, so I wouldn't be paying a premium price. It's kind of I'm more so waiting towards the end of the deadline. If Chicago hasn't really found a buyer, if they lower their prices, then maybe you take a look. But I think of the list here, and that includes Tyler Bertuzzi, who I just don't see as having the real high end talent as anyone else on this list. I would say Barbashev is probably my guy, but I'm not paying a premium price for him. Probably just going to sit back and maybe hope that I have a couple of top prospects waiting on my AHL team to come and fill that gap, because you don't want to pay a premium for those complimentary guys. A lot of players that can make a difference for you are already playing on your minor league team. And I think teams need to kind of look for their own AHL teams and understand them better, understand those players, kind of push them up into top six roles at an earlier date.
Cam, if you are sitting back and you're a general manager, it's kind of waiting for a low-priced acquisition. A guy on this list here quickly, Gustav Nyquist. I said in a funny way, with the injury that he has and him being out for the rest of the regular season and can hop back in with the playoffs and have basically no cap consequence. In my eyes, his value actually went up a little bit. Would you take a swing with a mid to late round pick on Gustav Nyquist to plop into your roster for playoff time?
Well, in the COVID season, we actually did that with another Columbus forward in Riley Nash, and that didn't really work out for us too well. So I'm a little shell shocked on doing stuff like that. But yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. And I think you're not going to get the high end value with a guy like Nyquist, but he is I think that you might also be in a situation where other teams are kind of looking to do a similar thing, but it is an interesting idea. And I always like the look of creating different things, creating different looks, and having him kind of in as an extra guy to bring in for game 2, game 3 of your series. Not a huge difference maker, but obviously I think someone that could probably come in. I think that you could probably find an equivalent on your AHL team for a guy like Nyquist.
Interesting stuff, as always, going inside the numbers with Cam Charron, brought to you by our friends at Montana's. This week on our social channels, Daily Faceoff on Instagram and Twitter, we are giving away a $100 gift card. So go hit them up. Find out how you can get a chance to win 100 bones to Montana's. That goes a long way with their lineup of daily deals. Cam, thanks for doing this again this week. We'll chat next week.
Yep. See you later, Tyler and Frank.
Moving along to our daily face-off inbox question, hashtag AskDFO. Frank, we've been hearing for months about the third-party broker, and the question we have for you today is there an actual sort of algorithm or thought process behind how much these third-party brokers can get based on the amount of money they retain?
Yeah, there is. I actually wrote it a couple weeks back as part of our deadline countdown series, really early on in the process. Which third-party brokers could be involved, but also if you take a look at some of the other deals that have been made, there's only been 6 retained salary transactions involving 3 teams in NHL history. You can actually map out exactly as I did here, the third-party broker cost in real cash dollars. That's what's important, is what is a team actually going to have to pay out in salary, not so much cap space, because so many different teams have varying levels of cap space that at some point it all becomes the same. So this is sort of what the chart looks like. If you're retaining $350,000 in that neighborhood, you're probably looking at a fourth, $500,000, a third. One thing to keep in mind as we look at 2 of the very biggest cap hits that could potentially be on the move in Kane and Taves at this deadline is they have $10.5 in salary cap, but their real cash is way lower. So any team that would get involved in retaining salary for these guys is probably looking in that 4th to 5th round pick range territory, unless there's a bidding war of some sorts to get in on it. So it's not going to be exorbitant for a third-party team to get involved in the Kane situation, which is kind of what I mapped out in that matchmaker series with Kane and the Oilers.
Interesting stuff. Yeah, so not necessarily the cap hit, but instead the real dollars left on the deal for the remainder of the season, since that's what they would ultimately be keeping. And you can see here a 2025 5th-round pick is what you had mapped out in a potential Patrick Kane trade. Very interesting, and something we're going to probably be relying on that chart quite a bit over the next 16 days. Let's move along to our PointsBet daily bets for today. 2 plays that I like on, I'd say, medium-sized slate in the NHL. So let's jump into it, starting with a little over-under action I got for tonight. Buffalo has been crushing the over as of late. Back-to-back wins, and you know what? It's actually been 14 games in a row for them where it's been at least 5 total goals, Frank. They have been a very high-scoring team. They're going up against a Ducks team that's also hit the over in back-to-back, so I do like the over there. And I also like the New York Rangers tonight. They're taking on the Vancouver Canucks. It's a Rangers team that's won 5 in a row, covered the puck line in 3 straight. The Canucks have lost 2 in a row to the Red Wings, failed the cover in both of those games. Red hot team, ice cold team, and as you can see, it's a very nice payout. Plus 135 on the Rangers to just win by 2 or more. I love that spot. And like I said, Buffalo, Anaheim over 6.5. The payout there, not as great, but these are 2 teams that have both seen the over hit in back-to-back games. So a couple of really solid spots on tonight's slate, courtesy of our friends at Pointsbet Canada. And Frank, we will wrap up in the final minute of the show with a little garbage time. What do you got?
Yeah, Tyler, I started my career covering hockey actually in the ECHL rinks with the Trenton Titans nearby here in Philadelphia. And I wanted to give a little love. I always keep an eye on the minor league game to Mike Pellick, who set the ECHL's all-time games played record with the Atlanta Gladiators on Tuesday night. 860 career ECHL games.
Wow.
That's a lot of games in the coast. That's a ton. And Mike Pellick, he's from, of course, the Pellick family. His brother Adam plays for the New York Islanders. His brother Matt also got a taste of the NHL and played in the AHL and ECHL before ending his career in Europe. Mike, a 6th-round pick of the Los Angeles Kings way back in 2009, 33 years old. He has grinded out a heck of a career. So wanted to give a shout out to Mike Pellick. Man, that's a lot of time on the bus, Tyler. A lot of crappy meals, a lot of crappy paychecks to play the game that you love.
Yeah, I absolutely love stories like this. Guys who are really doing it for the love of the game. Big shout out to Mike Pellick. We would also be remiss, Frank, if we didn't wrap up the show by offering our condolences to Alex Ovechkin and his family. Ovechkin announcing today on Instagram the passing of his father and asking for privacy in this time. Yesterday it was announced he'd be taking a leave from the team. So our condolences to Ovechkin and his family. That's going to be a wrap on today's edition of the show. Thanks to everyone who tuned in and was active on the YouTube chat, as they have been all week. We'll be back tomorrow, noon Eastern, with another edition of Daily Faceoff Live.
Thanks for tuning in to Daily Faceoff Live. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to never miss an episode.